The room was already loud when Carol Whitmore lifted the violation letter like a trophy. Her voice cut through the chatter. Sharp, rehearsed, certain. This board will not tolerate deliberate noncompliance. Every seat in the clubhouse was filled. Neighbors lined the back wall, arms folded, waiting for the show. Mark didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, walked to the front table, and placed a single certified document beside her neatly stacked papers. The sound it made was small. The silence that followed wasn't. A county environmental officer stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. That property, he said evenly, is now protected under state wildlife habitat designation. Carol blinked. Just once. The confidence drained from her face in real time. Murmurs spread. A phone lifted to record. Does this mean we're liable? Someone whispered. The officer didn't hesitate. If the HOA attempts removal, penalties begin at $10,000. That was the moment everything shifted. 6 months earlier, it had started with a $500 fine. 6 months earlier, Mark Ellison's mornings were quiet. At 48, he had settled into a rhythm that suited him, measured, practical, deliberate. An engineer by trade, he believed most problems had solutions if you were patient enough to look for them. He'd bought the house 12 years ago, back when the neighborhood was new and the lawns were all identical squares of obedient green. Back then, his yard matched the rest. Then came the drought. One summer stretched into another with barely any rain. Water restrictions tightened. Bills climbed. The grass browned no matter how carefully he timed the sprinklers. Mark stood at the edge of his lawn one evening, watching it crisp under a merciless sun, and realized he was paying more every month to keep something alive that didn't belong there. His wife, Anna, would have said the same. She'd loved gardening, not the rigid kind, but the kind that hummed. Bees, butterflies, native blooms that returned each season without begging for chemicals and constant irrigation. After she passed, the yard felt like the last place her fingerprints still lingered. So Mark began to research. Native milkweed, purple coneflower, little bluestem, black-eyed Susan. Plants that had survived in the region long before sprinkler systems and HOA covenants. Plants that didn't demand. They adapted. He worked slowly, methodically. Section by section, the thirsty turf disappeared. In its place rose texture and color, soft grasses bending in the wind, orange monarchs drifting in lazy arcs, bees tracing invisible maps between blossoms. It wasn't chaos. It was design without rigidity. Small wooden markers identified each species. Water usage dropped by nearly 40% within 3 months. The soil darkened, richer than before. Some neighbors slowed their cars to look. A few asked polite questions. No one complained. In the early mornings, Mark sat on the porch with his coffee and watched butterflies gather where grass used to struggle. It felt like restoration, not just of land, but of something steadier inside him. The house was nearly paid off. On a fixed income and careful budgeting that mattered. It was more than property. It was memory. It was security, which was why the envelope felt heavier than it should have. It was taped to his mailbox one Tuesday morning. HOA letterhead. Bold across the top. Violation notice. Lawn neglect. 14 days to correct. $500 if he didn't. Carol Whitmore liked things orderly. At 62, she carried herself with the polished assurance of someone who had spent decades closing real estate deals and correcting other people's assumptions. Her hair was always set, her blazers sharply tailored, her smile thin but present. She spoke in phrases that sounded cooperative while leaving little room for disagreement. It's about maintaining standards, she would say, protecting everyone's investment. As HOA president, Carol treated the neighborhood like a portfolio. She drove its streets slowly each afternoon in her white Lexus, window half lowered, scanning for deviations. A trash bin left out too long. A fence leaning a fraction off plumb. Hedges growing uneven. Notes were dictated into her phone before she even reached the stop sign. Reminder emails arrived at 6:03 a.m. sharp. Subject lines in bold. Courtesy masked as compliance. The beautification committee had been her idea. She chaired it. To Carol, lawns weren't ecosystems. They were signals, evidence that a homeowner understood discipline. Uniform grass meant stability. Stability meant value. One evening, seated at her kitchen island beneath pendant lights, she reviewed the neighborhood's aerial survey from the HOA's annual property assessment. Most lots blended into a seamless wash of green. Then there was Mark's. From above, his yard looked textured, uneven, flecked with irregular shapes. Patches of tawny grass interspersed with bursts of color. It interrupted the symmetry. Carol zoomed in, zoomed further. She circled areas with a digital stylus, her lips tightening. Blight, she murmured. She printed the image, slid it into a folder already labeled with Mark's address, and the next morning drove over personally. Clipboard in hand, posture rigid. She didn't knock immediately. She surveyed. Then she stepped toward his porch. It was their first direct conversation. Mark was checking his mailbox when Carol's shadow crossed the driveway. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Clipboard tucked against her side, she gestured broadly toward the yard. Coneflowers nodded in the breeze behind her, bees hovering lazily above the milkweed. "This looks abandoned," she said. Mark followed her gaze. "It's native restoration," he replied evenly. "Reduced water use, pollinator support. It's intentional." Carol's smile thinned. "The covenants require maintained turf grass." He opened his mouth to explain the drought data, the 40% drop in water consumption, the return of monarchs he hadn't seen in years. She cut him off with a practiced motion and extended the envelope. Official letterhead, bold text, 14 days to correct the violation. $500 if not resolved. "And if it remains non-compliant," she added, tapping the paper with one manicured finger, "additional daily penalties may apply." That evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table with the neighborhood bylaws spread before him. He read them the way he read engineering schematics, line by line, looking for clarity. What he found was anything but visually maintained landscaping consistent with neighborhood aesthetic. No definition of turf grass. No prohibition of native plants. Just language wide enough to bend. He drafted a careful email to the board. He cited water conservation statistics, included photos documenting labeled species, attached a summary of state drought recommendations encouraging native landscaping. He pressed send and waited. The response came the next afternoon. 2 words. Non-compliant. Board decision final. On Saturday morning, another envelope appeared. Fine confirmed. $500. Failure to correct by Monday would result in an additional $50 per day. The tone had shifted from warning to enforcement. Mark stood at the edge of his yard, watching a butterfly settle briefly on a bloom before lifting again. For the first time, confusion gave way to calculation. If this was going to escalate, he would need more than explanations. The notice didn't stay private for long. By midweek, a copy of Mark's violation appeared on the glass bulletin board outside the clubhouse, pinned beneath a heading labeled, "Active Compliance Matters." His address was bolded. The phrase "lawn neglect" sat beneath it like a brand. Neighbors slowed when they passed his house now. Conversations dipped as he walked by. No one confronted him directly, but the air felt different, curiosity edged with caution. Social pressure, quiet but deliberate. Carol's next move arrived by certified mail. The envelope was thicker, heavier. Inside was a letter from the HOA's attorney. The language had changed, less neighborly, more surgical. Immediate compliance demanded. Continued violation could result in a lien placed against the property. Legal remedies reserved. Mark read it twice, then set it down carefully. The total fines had climbed past $800. 3 days later, a landscaping company truck idled at the curb, while a man in a branded polo shirt walked the perimeter of Mark's yard, measuring. That afternoon, another document hit his inbox. Estimate for restoration to HOA standards. Restoration meant removal. The cost was listed beneath in bold. His options narrowed into hard lines. Pay the fines and surrender. tear out months of work with his own hands, or refuse and watch penalties stack until the house itself was leverage. Carol, meanwhile, grew more visible. She referenced the situation in neighborhood emails about curb appeal. She stopped twice on his street in one afternoon, tablet raised, taking photos from different angles. Mark responded in the opposite direction. He stopped explaining, stopped defending. He documented. Every letter scanned, every email archived, every fine logged with date and timestamp. At the next HOA meeting, he arrived early and signed in to speak. When the agenda shifted to compliance matters, he raised his hand. Carol didn't look at him. Homeowner comments on active violations will not be recognized during this portion, she said smoothly. We must maintain order. Maintain order. She spoke about standards, about property values, about protecting investments. She never said his name, but everyone knew. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat as if considering speaking, then thought better of it. Silence carried the vote. By the end of the week, the fines crossed $1,200. Mark sat at his kitchen table long after dark, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. The stack of documents beside him had grown thick. Authority was leaning on him publicly, legally, financially. He opened his laptop and began searching beyond the HOA bylaws. State statutes, water conservation mandates, landscaping restrictions. Hours passed. Then, buried in a drought response amendment from 2 years earlier, he found a phrase that made him sit up straighter. Escalation. The phrase was buried halfway down page 43 of a drought mitigation amendment passed 2 years earlier. Right to natural landscaping. Mark leaned closer to the screen. The statute was precise where the HOA bylaws had been vague. Residential property owners could not be prohibited from installing drought-resistant or native landscaping. More importantly, homeowners who obtained certified wildlife habitat designation through the state environmental agency were explicitly protected from HOA enforcement actions that contradicted conservation standards. He read that sentence 3 times. HOAs cannot prohibit certified native wildlife habitats recognized by the state. The protection wasn't automatic. Certification required documentation, an inventory of species, a basic site map, and an inspection confirming habitat criteria. Food sources, water access, shelter, sustainable practices. Mark's eyes drifted to the window. Milkweed, coneflower, little bluestem, a shallow stone basin he'd installed for birds last spring. Layered vegetation providing cover. No chemical treatments. He opened the certification checklist and began comparing line by line. Food source diversity, met. Native plant ratio exceeded. Water availability, present. Sustainable maintenance, documented. Outside, his phone buzzed again. Another HOA email reminding him that daily penalties would continue until resolved. Inside, the house remained still. He printed the statute, highlighted the relevant clauses, cross-referenced the environmental agency website, downloaded the application packet. The contrast was almost absurd. The board was escalating with threats and public postings. Carol was tightening pressure, confident that the rules were on her side. But the rules she knew were smaller than the ones that governed above her. Mark sat back, exhaled slowly, and allowed himself the smallest nod. Okay, he murmured. If this worked, the board wouldn't just lose a landscaping dispute. They would have initiated enforcement in direct conflict with state protection. Exposure wasn't loud. It was procedural. He opened a new folder on his desktop. Certification. And without announcing a thing, he began. Mark approached the process the way he approached structural design, quietly, methodically, without wasted motion. He began at sunrise, camera in hand, moving through the yard in deliberate sections. Each plant photographed, each species labeled and cross-referenced with its native classification. Milkweed clusters, purple coneflower in full bloom, little bluestem bending in pale gold arcs. He drafted a simple site map at his dining room table, measuring distances, marking habitat zones. He printed 3 months of water bills and highlighted the steady decline in usage. He started a logbook, noting monarch sightings, native bees, even the return of a goldfinch pair he hadn't seen since before the drought. He contacted a local conservation nonprofit for guidance. A volunteer coordinator walked the property one afternoon, nodding with visible approval. "You're already ahead of most applicants," she said. Mark installed small, unobtrusive boundary markers, clean, intentional edges that framed the habitat as design, not neglect. Then he submitted the application. While he assembled documentation, Carol intensified pressure. Daily fine notices arrived with mechanical consistency. A formal warning announced that the board would convene a special meeting to authorize corrective landscaping at homeowner expense. The total climbed past $1,500. Mark scheduled a brief consultation with an environmental attorney recommended by the nonprofit. The lawyer skimmed the statute, reviewed Mark's documentation, and leaned back with a faint smile. "If they push this after certification," he said, tapping the highlighted clause, "they're in trouble." Mark didn't smile. He simply nodded. This was the part they didn't see coming. 3 days before the scheduled HOA vote, an email arrived from the state agency. Inspection confirmed. The date was set for Friday morning. Certification still pending final approval. And Monday, according to the HOA notice, was enforcement day. By the time Friday arrived, the entire outcome balanced on a single visit. Friday morning arrived cool and bright. The state habitat inspector walked the perimeter with a clipboard, pausing to photograph plant clusters and kneel beside the shallow stone basin. He asked careful, technical questions. Mark answered each one calmly, producing his logbook when requested. "This is thorough," the inspector said at last. "You've done your homework." Relief began to loosen something in Mark's chest. Then a white Lexus rolled to a stop at the curb. Carol stepped out, sunglasses already in place, phone in hand. She approached with the brisk confidence of someone reclaiming control. "I need to clarify something," she said, addressing the inspector. "Our covenants supersede voluntary programs. This property is in violation of binding community standards." The inspector straightened. "State designation isn't voluntary once approved." "Approved," Carol repeated. "But it hasn't been." He hesitated. "Final certification requires state-level sign-off. Today's inspection is one step." The air shifted. 2 days later, an email arrived. "Application under extended review." No timeline given. That same evening, the HOA board voted to authorize corrective landscaping within 72 hours. The notice hit Mark's inbox just before dusk. Contractors scheduled for Monday morning. Certification pending. Not granted. For the first time since this began, the math didn't favor him. He stood at his porch, watching bees move through the fading light, and felt the clock ticking louder than the insect's wings. Then he went back inside and picked up the phone. Instead of waiting, he called the County Environmental Compliance Office directly. The truck arrived at 8:02 a.m. Mark heard it before he saw it. The low diesel growl followed by the metallic clatter of a trailer hitch settling into place. 2 men stepped out in matching polos, already pulling gas-powered trimmers from the truck bed. The first engine roared to life. The smell of gasoline cut through the cool morning air. Dew clung to the milkweed leaves, trembling as bees lifted abruptly, disturbed by the vibration. A monarch drifted upward, erratic, searching for quiet. Mark stepped onto his porch holding a single printed email. "Morning." One of the contractors called, not unkindly. "We've got authorization from the HOA." "I know," Mark said. Before he could say more, another vehicle turned onto the street. A dark county SUV with a green environmental seal on the door. It slowed, then pulled in behind the landscaping truck, blocking its exit. The engine of the nearest trimmer sputtered but continued whining. A uniformed county environmental compliance officer stepped out, badge clipped at his chest. He carried a folder. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, raising a hand, "I need those engines off." There was something in his tone that made them comply. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise. He handed the contractor a stamped document. "Temporary protection order," he said. Habitat certification approved effective immediately. Retroactive to inspection date. Mark exhaled, but only slightly. The officer continued, voice clear enough for the nearest houses to hear. Any removal or destruction of plant material on this property now constitutes destruction of protected wildlife habitat under state statute. The car door slammed. Carol crossed the street quickly, face flushed, papers clutched in one hand. This is private property governed by binding covenants, she began. The officer didn't raise his voice. And it is now protected under state law. If the HOA proceeds with enforcement, penalties begin at $10,000, not including mandatory restoration. Silence settled across the street. Curtains shifted. Front doors opened. Neighbors stepped onto porches, drawn by the sudden stillness. Carol's composure fractured in small, visible ways. This is highly irregular, she said, but the certainty was gone. Mark remained where he was, hands at his sides. He didn't need to say anything. By noon, an emergency HOA meeting had been scheduled for that evening. By evening, every folding chair in the clubhouse was filled. The air felt different than past meetings, less routine, more reckoning. Carol called the session to order, voice tight but composed. Before she could settle into her script, the county environmental officer stood and requested the floor. This time, no one denied it. He read directly from the statute, clear and unhurried. Certified wildlife habitats, once approved, were protected from conflicting HOA enforcement. Retroactive to inspection date. Civil penalties for interference. Mandatory restoration costs. The words landed heavier than any accusation. Mark followed with a small stack of documents. He presented water usage data showing measurable reductions. Summaries of peer-reviewed studies linking native landscaping to stable property values. The highlighted section of state law. He didn't editorialize. He didn't gloat. Halfway through, a man in the second row raised his hand. "So the board exposed us to liability?" he asked plainly. A ripple moved through the room. Carol straightened. "We were protecting community standards," she insisted. "That's our duty." "But at what risk?" someone else said. Phones were visible now, screens glowing as neighbors recorded. Whispered conversations threaded through the space. One of the board members, quiet until now, removed his nameplate and set it on the table. "I wasn't aware of the statute," he said, standing. "I'm resigning, effective immediately." The shift was palpable. A motion was called to rescind all fines against Mark Ellison and suspend enforcement actions pending policy review. Hands rose across the room. Carol's authority thinned with each vote counted aloud. By the time the final tally was announced, it was no longer her meeting. A second motion followed, to remove her as president pending a formal election. This time, the hands went up faster. The vote stood. By the end of the week, every fine against Mark's property was formally rescinded in writing. The HOA treasurer issued a reimbursement check covering his legal consultation fee, labeled simply, "Compliance Review Adjustment." The language was careful. The shift in power was not. Within a month, the board amended the landscaping policy to explicitly allow certified native and drought-resistant yards, provided documentation was on file. The wording was clearer now, less room for interpretation, less room for control disguised as aesthetics. Carol stopped driving the neighborhood in slow patrols. She attended one more meeting, seated in the second row instead of at the front table. 3 months later, a real estate sign appeared on her lawn. By early fall, the house was listed. Change moved more quietly through the neighborhood. A retired couple down the street replaced a strip of turf with wildflowers. Another homeowner installed a rain garden near the sidewalk. Patches of color began interrupting the old uniform green. Not chaos. Choice. Mark added one final detail to his yard. A small bronze plaque mounted near the walkway. Certified wildlife habitat. Mornings returned to their earlier rhythm. Coffee on the porch, bees moving lazily between blooms. But the peace felt different now. Not passive. Earned. Authority had leaned hard. Preparation had leaned back harder. And the land, finally, was allowed to be what it was meant to be. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the roofs and softened the edges of the street, Mark sat on his porch and watched the yard breathe. Butterflies drifted through the tall stems, unbothered now. The air carried the faint sweetness of coneflower and warm soil. Nothing about it looked neglected. It looked alive. He thought about how quickly authority had escalated: letters, threats, public postings. How confident it had sounded. How certain. And how thin it had been once examined. Authority, he realized, often survives on assumption. On the idea that no one will read past the first layer of rules. Preparation changes that. Research changes that. Calm changes that. Carol had relied on position. He had relied on information. One raised her voice. The other printed the statute. They thought it was just an ugly lawn, he murmured to himself. If you've ever dealt with someone who mistook authority for power, you already know, sometimes the smartest response isn't louder. The steadier. Is better prepared. And in this neighborhood, that wasn't the last time someone underestimated a homeowner. If the story resonated with you, let me know in the comments and stick around. There's more where this came from.